Black janitor hid her secret past as a fighter pilot for 6 years. The early morning air clung to the concrete with a kind of chilled stubbornness that only a base in the Midwest could produce. It was the kind of cold that seeped through uniforms, crept into boots, and made men and women pull their collars higher and their thoughts inward. At Wrightson Air Base, just outside Columbus, Ohio, activity stirred well before the sun ever broke the horizon. Recruits were already running laps around the tarmac, jets were rumbling awake in their hangars, and officers clicked their way into debriefing rooms like chess pieces in motion. Amid all the steel and structure, a figure moved quietly along the edge of the hangars. A woman with a mop, a bucket, and a cart full of supplies. She wore the dark navy uniform of civilian maintenance, a name tag barely clinging to the pocket of her shirt. T. Brooks. Her boots were scuffed, her hands calloused, her afro tucked under a simple knit cap. No one really noticed her, and that's how she liked it. They called her Miss Brooks, out of habit, though few knew her first name and fewer still cared to ask. In a place dominated by ambition, swagger, and speed, a janitor was background noise. She cleaned the floors, scrubbed oil from hangar walls, emptied trash bins filled with sandwich wrappers and torn flight manuals. She moved with purpose, silently gliding through each day like a ghost. Efficient. Every morning at 4:45 a.m. sharp, before even the most caffeine-fueled commanders had stirred, she was on base. Every evening at 8:00 p.m., after the last debriefing light dimmed, she disappeared like a shadow into the dark. She spoke little, smiled politely when addressed, and kept her headphones in when she worked. Though the cord trailed nowhere. There was no music, just silence. But those who paid attention, if any really did, might have noticed something off. Something precise. She didn't just mop, she patterned her movements like a pilot running checklists. She didn't just clean aircraft, she traced her gloved fingers across their exteriors with the quiet reverence of someone who once understood what it meant to fly one. When airmen talked about their latest simulations, she paused. When they fumbled a term like OA or confused airspeed with ground speed, her jaw would clench ever so subtly. 6 years she had been there. No one asked where she came from. No one wondered how she landed a government job without any military records attached. The base needed janitors, and she did the work with no complaints, no sick days, and no demands. The higher-ups marked her as dependable but forgettable, the kind of person who didn't require paperwork to understand the job. Just let her mop and go. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning, January, frigid, gray skies overhead, when something shifted. She was in Hangar 9, the so-called birdcage, where prototypes and advanced flight simulations were housed. Few janitors were ever cleared to clean that space, but Miss Brooks had somehow received quiet approval years ago. Maybe someone had pushed it through, maybe it was an oversight. Either way, she moved between the flight trainers and monitors like she belonged there. That morning, Second Lieutenant Jacob Harlan, fresh out of the academy and full of raw confidence, was struggling through a pre-flight checklist on the F-16 simulator. His brow furrowed, fingers fumbling through switch sequences, unsure whether his error was procedural or technical. A coffee sat untouched on the desk. Frustration built in his breath. Engine start, ECS, hydraulic, damn it, he muttered, swiping across the touchscreen with increasing annoyance. From across the hangar, Miss Brooks paused mid-mop. She watched without saying a word, her eyes scanning the panel. "You're missing the ECS valve switch," she said calmly, without looking up. Harlan froze. "What?" She finally turned toward him. "You're missing the environmental control system's toggle. It's defaulted to auxiliary power. You need to cycle it manually after system boot." The young pilot blinked at her. "How do you know that?" She didn't answer. She turned back to her mop and resumed scrubbing. Harlan stood. "Hey, you been watching these sims? Who told you that?" A still nothing. She reached for the bucket. "You military?" he asked, skeptical. "No," she said simply. Then added, "Not anymore." He chuckled, a little awkwardly. "You read the manuals or something?" "No," she said again. This time with finality. Word started to spread. Harlan told a couple buddies. One of them asked her a question later that week, an offhand quiz on G-forces during a dive roll. She answered it casually while emptying a trash can. Then again, when someone mentioned the wrong NATO phonetic code, she corrected it without thinking. By the third week of January, the whisper had traveled up to Captain Lauren Vega, head of training operations. Vega was skeptical, a janitor with knowledge of F-16 operations, flight simulation patterns, air maneuver terminology. It didn't make sense. She pulled Brooks aside one afternoon during a routine inspection. "I hear you've been giving my recruits flying tips," Vega said, arms crossed, voice firm. Brooks didn't look up from wiping down a control console. "I answered a few questions." "Are you former Air Force?" "No, ma'am." "Then how do you know about flight protocol?" I read a lot. Vega narrowed her eyes. You fly. Brooks met her gaze unblinking. Not in a long time. That was enough to send Vega digging. But nothing turned up. No active duty records under T. Brooks. No discharge papers. No pilot's license on file. It was as though she had never served a day in her life. But not all files are public. In a military environment where records matter more than impressions, most shrugged it off. Maybe she'd had family in the Air Force. Maybe she was just some aviation nerd. Let her mop and mutter about aircraft if she wanted. No harm done. But for Miss Brooks, the whispers started to unravel something she had buried deep. Every night she returned home to a small, quiet apartment in a part of town nobody from base ever visited. No photos, no flags, no medals. Just one locked wooden box under her bed. Inside were a set of dusty dog tags, an old flight patch stitched with the word A-Shub-Key-E, and a folded letter of commendation with her full name, Captain Teresa L. Brooks, USAF. She had once flown F-22 Raptors. She had once outmaneuvered 2 MiGs over hostile airspace in a classified operation never publicly acknowledged. She had once been called the sharpest set of wings on the eastern seaboard. Until it all fell apart. Now, she mopped hangar floors. But the base had changed. These kids weren't like the old guard. They talked too much, listened too little. They laughed too easily at failure. And worse, they were being trained too quickly. It gnawed at her, the way they stumbled through maneuvers she once flew in her sleep. Not because they were stupid, but because they weren't being taught well. She watched quietly, invisibly, and waited. Until one day she wouldn't be able to stay silent any longer. The winter light blood through the high windows of Hangar 4 in fractured beams, refracting off the polished fuselages of 3 idle fighter jets. Snow fell softly outside, but inside the cavernous space, the air was metallic and tense. Teresa Brooks stood in the corner near the maintenance lockers, scrubbing down a tool cabinet with industrial-grade cleaner. To the casual observer, she was just another fixture in the hangar. A mop, a pair of gloves, a name badge, and silence. But to those who had begun to whisper about her, she had become something else entirely. They called her Eagle Eyes, behind her back now. A half-joke, a little myth made up by the newest batch of recruits. They said she could spot a failed pre-flight sequence before the techs did. That she once recited a checklist from memory after overhearing it once. That she corrected a captain's radio call sign from 100 feet away. Most of it wasn't true. But not all of it was false. Lieutenant Harlan had started stopping by her cleaning stations more often, under the pretense of polite small talk. She ignored him at first, but over time, his persistence chipped away at her indifference. He had an eagerness she remembered, bright-eyed, hungry, a little cocky. She saw herself in him, even if she didn't want to. So, if you were a pilot, he said one afternoon, pretending to organize flight logs nearby, would you have gone air superiority or strike? She didn't answer at first, just kept cleaning the console. He tried again. I mean, obviously you know stuff. Even Vega's talking about it. You ever fly a Raptor? She turned to face him. Her eyes were tired but steady. That's a question that doesn't need an answer. Why not? Because if I say yes, then I'm lying. If I say no, you won't believe me. Harlan didn't press. But the seed had already been planted. A week later, Captain Vega summoned her again. This is off the record, Vega said, crossing her arms as she stood beside a new simulator rig in the East Wing. I want you to sit in this sim and run through a basic flight protocol. No combat scenario, just start, up and taxi. Brooks looked at the rig. She hadn't sat in a cockpit, real or simulated, in almost a decade. Her palms itched with nerves she hadn't felt in years. I'm not cleared for this, she said. I'm clearing you, Vega replied. Just humor me. Brooks hesitated, then stepped forward. The second she sat down, muscle memory took over. Her fingers danced lightly over the controls, not rushing, just reacquainting. Switches clicked, displays lit up. She toggled the throttle, calibrated the HUD, tested the flaps. In under 90 seconds the sim powered to life and showed RAY in green across the dash. Vega didn't say a word. Brooks sat in silence for another 10 seconds, then pulled herself out of the seat. You were a pilot, Vega said finally. I was a lot of things, Brooks replied. Why'd you stop? Brooks didn't answer. Instead, she nodded once and walked out of the simulator room, leaving Vega staring at the still, glowing interface. Back in her small apartment that night, Brooks opened the old wooden box beneath her bed again. This time she unfolded the letter. Captain Teresa L. Brooks is hereby relieved of active flight status pending the outcome of administrative review. It had been 8 years, but she still remembered every word. The mission had gone sideways. Too much smoke, not enough intel, a compromised airstrip, and a target that hadn't been where they said it was. Her wingman hadn't made it out. Command needed someone to blame, And Teresa had been too high profile, too ambitious, too good to ignore. They stripped her flight badge in a quiet courtroom surrounded by polished shoes and cold stares. No court-martial, no trial, just a slow, brutal exile. She had left the skies and never looked back. Until now. The next morning, word of her simulator performance had leaked. Recruits started lining up outside Hangar 9, pretending to need help cleaning gear just to get a glimpse of her. One even asked for her autograph, half as a joke, half in awe. She refused, and the kid left red-faced. But the base had shifted. Her anonymity had cracked. Vega called her in again that Friday. "There's a proposal," she said. Brooks raised an eyebrow. "What kind?" "A new combat flight training module. I need someone with real experience to review it before we run it. You'd be consulting. I'm not a contractor. You'd be temporary. Anonymous. No exposure." Brooks exhaled slowly. "Why me?" "Because I've looked at the tapes," Vega said. "You weren't just a pilot. You were elite." Brooks didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out the window where the jets lined the runway like sleeping giants. "I'll look at it," she said. "But I'm not putting the uniform back on." "You don't have to," Vega replied. "But something tells me it's still in your closet." Brooks left the office that day with a flash drive, a classified file folder, and a feeling in her chest she hadn't known in years. Purpose. But purpose was a double-edged blade. The deeper she reviewed the training module, the more she saw its flaws. Maneuvers that lacked real-world application. Scenarios that had been sanitized for politics. Techniques that wouldn't survive a real dogfight. She annotated the entire file with blunt, cutting remarks. Not to humiliate, but to save lives. These kids were being sent into simulations that wouldn't prepare them for real skies. She knew the difference. She had paid the price to know the difference. When she handed the file back to Vega, it came with an ultimatum: either revamp the training, or stop pretending it prepared anyone. Vega didn't argue. She knew the truth. But others noticed the shift too. Higher-ups, whisperers. People who recognized old call signs and started asking dangerous questions. Who was this janitor? Why was she listed in no active duty rosters but had full knowledge of classified procedures? And worse, why was she right? Back in her apartment, Brooks found herself standing by the window more often, watching the clouds. Something in her stirred. The skies called to her again, not with nostalgia, but with urgency. She wasn't just a ghost anymore. She was becoming a reckoning. And the hangars were starting to remember her name. She had once said that silence was the only way she could live with the noise. Noise of betrayal. Noise of engines. Noise of the past roaring behind her in a sonic boom she couldn't outrun. But silence wasn't peace. It was survival. And for 6 years that survival had lived in the form of a mop, gloves, and a name tag that told only part of her story. But now, that silence was fraying. The whispers around base had grown teeth. Some were tinged with admiration, others with disbelief. A few, however, carried suspicion. And Teresa Brooks could feel it. Ice lingering too long in the break room. Conversations that halted when she walked by. More importantly, access that suddenly got harder. Systems she once cleaned freely now needed reauthorization. And base security. They started logging her comings and goings like she was no longer invisible, but a variable. She should have walked away right then. Should have left Wrightson for good, disappeared again into another town with another low-profile job. She'd done it before, but something rooted her this time, not pride, not vengeance, something else. Responsibility. She had seen the raw data in the new training modules. She knew what poor simulation prep led to in the real world. Crashes. Deaths. Cover-ups. She'd lived through it. The last time she spoke out, they destroyed her career. The next time she stayed silent, a 21-year-old wingman. Fresh out of flight school, undertrained, overconfident. Blood out in the cockpit of an F-22 that was never supposed to be airborne that night. His name had been Caleb Roman. And she still remembered every syllable of the Mayday call that never reached a runway. Now, here at Wrightson, they were cutting the same corners. And they were pushing these kids into birds too fast, with too little. She couldn't stay silent. But before she could speak, the past came for her first. It began with a visit, not from a captain or even a colonel, but a civilian, tall, wire-framed glasses, gray suit that didn't quite fit his frame. He waited for her at the edge of Hangar 9, hands folded neatly, like he was waiting to take her confession. "Mems Brooks," he said smoothly, "or should I say Captain?" She didn't stop mopping. "You shouldn't say anything," he gave a plastic smile. "You're hard to track. Your file was sealed under Directive 77G. That's rare." "I'm not a threat," she said, too quickly. He raised an eyebrow. "That's not why I'm here. I'm from the Department of Veteran Affairs." "Well, sort of. I'm attached to a joint task force that oversees exceptional discharge cases." She laughed bitterly. "Exceptional. That's a word for it. He stepped closer. You've been off the grid for almost a decade, and now you're showing up in classified simulator records, advising base captains, correcting flight protocols. It raises eyebrows. I was asked, she said evenly, and you accepted. She stopped. Her mop rested in the bucket, dripping slowly. Her shoulders tightened. I accepted because I buried a man who trusted the system more than I did, she said. And I won't let another one follow him. The man didn't reply right away. Instead, you had 216 logged flight hours before your discharge. Top 3% in response times, decorated for evasive flight under pressure in Operation Redscape. Then, you vanished. She said nothing. Why come back now? She looked at him, her voice low. Because they're making the same mistakes. He nodded slowly. And if you were asked to testify to that in a congressional subcommittee? Her answer was immediate. No. Why not? Because it wouldn't save anyone. It would just bury the rest of my life. He closed the file. Then maybe there's another way. Later that evening, back in her apartment, she found herself sitting on the floor with the flight patch in her hands. Haki. Her old call sign. A name that had once carried weight. She had earned it in a dust storm over northern Afghanistan, spotting an incoming SAM before any radar picked it up. Her instincts saved the whole squadron that day. That was the first time she made headlines, briefly, quietly. The military never liked talking too much about the role of women, especially black women, in combat, so her success was turned into a footnote, a blurred image in an internal newsletter. Still, she had flown. Until the mission that changed everything. She remembered it in flashes. Her wingman screaming over the comms, the altimeter blinking red, the sudden yaw as the stabilizer failed, and the silence that followed, the eerie, perfect silence after the crash, when she stood alone in a burned-out crater with the wind howling past twisted metal. The board had blamed her for violating engagement protocols. They said her instincts had overridden orders. She had saved dozens but lost one, and that was enough. Discharged, sealed, forgotten, until Wrightson. Until now. That same week, Lieutenant Harlan came to her with a problem. We're getting a new training slate, he said. They want us in the air in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. She repeated. Yeah. Fast-tracked. He looked away. We're skipping a bunch of sim scenarios. She stared at him. That's suicide. He nodded. They told us it's new policy. But no one's ready. Brooks exhaled. What do you want from me? To teach us, he said quietly. Off the books. You're asking me to run unauthorized flight drills. I'm asking you to help us survive. She should have said no. But she didn't. That night, she broke into the old training wing with Harlan and 3 other recruits, Martinez, Dorsey, and Lynn. They called it Study Hall. But it was more than that. Brooks reprogrammed the sims herself, creating real-life combat scenarios from memory. She drilled them on flanking patterns, G-force management, emergency ejections. She made them recite stall recovery procedures until they dreamed them. And she never once asked for credit. By the end of week 2, they were outperforming the official syllabus. But not everyone was pleased. Captain Vega pulled her aside. I should court-martial you. Then do it, Brooks replied. Or take the data to the Pentagon. Vega paused. They've never flown cleaner. I saw Harlan's sim readout. That kid went from crash-prone to combat-capable in 2 weeks. Brooks didn't gloat. She just waited. Vega sighed. Keep it off the books. But if anyone asks, I didn't know. Brooks nodded once. That night, after the last sim shut down and the kids went home, she lingered in the cockpit, fingers on the throttle. Her mind back in the skies. A place she had once ruled. A place that had betrayed her. For the first time in years, she allowed herself a whisper. I still remember how to fly. The next day the crisis came. An in-air emergency, a solo trainee panicked mid-flight during an engine stall. Radio blackout, no instructors in range, and only one person on base who recognized the failure pattern instantly from the sound alone. Brooks dropped her mop and walked toward the tower. The alarms pierced the sky like a scream. Every officer within range of the flight tower snapped to attention. One of the jets, a T-38 Tylon mid-training flight, had gone silent over the comms, its transponder blinking erratically on the radar. Lieutenant Dorsey was in the air alone, on what was supposed to be a routine test circuit. Now, he was spinning toward the Earth at Mach 0.7 with a destabilized yaw vector and no voice contact. In the control tower, confusion reigned. Young airmen scrambled to decode the telemetry, while seasoned officers barked into radios trying to hail the pilot. But the vector drift was widening, and the descent rate was too fast. A stall pattern, nose down, likely panic-induced. Brooks didn't wait for orders. She had been pushing a mop bucket through the corridor when she heard the clipped tone of the emergency klaxon. That sound hadn't changed in decades. Short, sharp, mechanical. Like a stopwatch counting down the seconds to impact, her body moved before her mind did. Up the stairs, past the startled guards, straight into the tower. "What are you?" One officer started to shout, but she cut him off. "Patch me into Flight Echo 201. Manual override on comms." "You don't have clearance." "I don't need clearance to save his life," she snapped. "Override the line." A stunned pause followed. Then, miraculously, someone obeyed. Crackling static gave way to the hollow hiss of an open comm channel. No voice. Just the distant thrum of the engine, strained, sputtering. The Talon was at 9,000 feet and dropping fast. No control correction, no rudder stabilization, no brake flap extension. "Echo 201, Brooks said into the headset. "Do you copy?" "Nothing." "Oak 201, this is Hockey. Do you copy?" A burst of static. Then, faint, broken. "Mayday, can't pull up, elevators jammed." "Lieutenant Dorsey, listen to me," Brooks said, voice low, calm. "You're experiencing a tail stall. Your trim's locked. You're losing altitude at 300 feet per second. I need you to override your flight computer and switch to manual stick." I can't," came the panicked response. "Everything's vibrating. I think the stabilizer's torn." "You have less than 30 seconds to correct before ejection becomes impossible," she said. "Look at me, Lieutenant. Feel the jet, ignore the screens. Trust your seat of pants, silence. Then a weak, copy, kill your throttle to 60%. Rebalance using micro adjustments on your rudder pedals. Don't oversteer, feather it. Trust your instincts, you've got this." The control tower fell into total silence. Everyone leaned in, listening. The radar blip dipped, slowed, then stabilized. I've got pitch control," Dorsey breathed. Brooks nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Good. Bring it around. Half circle. Back to base, I'll walk you in." She guided him home with steady commands, every word precise. Every syllable familiar. And when the Talon's wheels kissed the runway, Brooks finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The tower erupted in applause. But Brooks didn't smile. She took off the headset and stepped back like a ghost, her eyes unreadable. "Who are you?" one airman finally asked. She looked past him, out at the sky, and said, "Someone who used to fly." By sundown it was no longer a secret. Word spread like a flash fire: the janitor had saved a jet. Not through luck, not by accident, with precision, with experience. With the unmistakable tone of someone who'd been in the sky and danced with death. Again and again. Captain Vega confronted her in the hangar. "They know," she said simply. Brooks nodded. "I figured. Command is furious. They're launching a review. I didn't do it for them." "I know." Vega looked at her, not with anger, but something closer to awe. "They're grounding the cadets for 2 days. Debrief, you've opened a storm." Brooks met her eyes. Then let it come. That night, she found her old flight suit. It was buried beneath boxes in her closet, folded tight in a sealed vacuum bag. A patch near the breast had faded over time. U.S. Air Force Brooks T. Call sign Hockey. Her fingers trembled as she held it. The last time she'd worn this, it had been in front of a tribunal that questioned her every decision, every command, every instinct that had once made her a legend. She should have burned it years ago. But now, she laid it across her bed like a banner raised. The next morning, an unmarked SUV arrived at her apartment. 2 officers in black suits stepped out. They didn't identify themselves, but they didn't need to. She recognized the posture. Internal affairs. Maybe JAG, possibly even something higher. They escorted her to Base Command HQ without handcuffs, but with no illusion of choice. She walked silently between them, head high. Inside the command conference room, 6 officers sat in a semicircle behind a long table. Colonel Mason, base commander, sat at the center. "Ms. Brooks," he began, "do you understand why you've been summoned?" She met his gaze. "Wes, you intervened in an active aerial emergency." "I did." "You are not authorized air command personnel." "No, I'm not. Yet you issued corrective instructions and assumed full override of tower communications. Because a pilot was about to die," she said simply. Colonel Mason tapped his fingers on a manila folder. "Your file is complicated. Highly redacted. It took us 6 hours to access it." "I didn't redact it." "No, but someone wanted it buried deep." He paused. "You were a decorated combat pilot. Highest honors in your class. You were recommended for instructor command at Fort Thompson. And then, I was discharged." He nodded. "For insubordination during a live mission. Failure to follow direct orders." Her voice cooled. "I followed the right orders. History may agree with you." He leaned back. "But we have a bigger problem now." "What?" "You've become a symbol. The cadets are calling you Captain Brooks. You've built an unauthorized training group. You saved one of my pilots from a crash with knowledge our own instructors didn't have. And now, Command wants to reinstate you. Silence. It hit her like a shockwave. She blinked, trying to process it. What? Colonel Mason nodded. They're invoking Directive 11C. Emergency reinstatement under wartime training exception. You'll be given a temporary rank. Flight privileges. Instructor status. No tribunal. Not yet. You'll be reviewed at the end of the quarter. But for now. He slid a small badge across the table. Welcome back, Captain. Her fingers hovered over it. She had dreamed of this moment 1,000 times. Sometimes with triumph, sometimes with bitterness. She had wanted to fight for her name. For justice. For dignity. But standing here now, the badge in front of her, all she felt was the weight. I didn't ask for this, she said. No, the colonel said. But maybe it asked for you. Later that afternoon, she walked onto the tarmac, this time not as a janitor, not as a ghost, but in uniform. A real one. Pilots stopped what they were doing when they saw her. Some saluted out of reflex, others whispered her name like a prayer. Captain Brooks. She walked up to Harlan, Dorsey, Lynn, and Martinez, her 4 rebels. The kids who trusted her before anyone else did. Get your gear, she said. We're doing night flight drills. They grinned. No one questioned her anymore. She looked up at the sky as the jets roared to life, and for the first time in 8 years, Teresa Brooks climbed back into a cockpit. Not because she had to. Because she chose to. The cockpit welcomed her back like an old friend who never asked questions. Teresa Brooks sat in the seat, her gloved hands sliding across the flight stick. Even after 8 years, the muscle memory remained. It was all still there. The subtle resistance in the pedals, the hum of energy in the console, the cold, clipped voice of the onboard systems check. She didn't feel nerves, she felt inevitability. Outside, the tarmac bustled with late, evening activity. 4 young pilots stood by their aircraft, checking gear under floodlights. Harlan, Martinez, Lynn, Dorsey. They weren't just cadets anymore. Not to her. They were the reason she was back in the air. Brooks clicked on her helmet mic. This is Captain Brooks. Check in. Each voice followed quickly. Lieutenant Harlan ready. Lieutenant Martinez locked in. Lieutenant Lynn, standing by. Lieutenant Dorsey, ready to fly. Brooks allowed herself the hint of a smile. Then let's fly. A 1 by 1, the jets pulled out onto the runway in formation. Brooks brought up the rear, her T-38 gleaming under the moonlight. Her bird, her sky. The takeoff was clean. The roar of acceleration, the moment of weightlessness as the ground dropped away. The embrace of altitude, she was home. The squadron rose above Wrightson Air Base in a tight diamond, engines howling like wolves reunited after a long winter. For the first few minutes, Brooks let them run drills, turns, stall recoveries, high G loops. She watched their telemetry with pride. They were improving faster than any training manual had ever projected. These kids were sharp, driven, and fearless. Because they knew who stood behind them. Not an officer with medals. A woman who had walked through fire and still climbed back into the sky. Then came the call from base. Ski group, this is control. Radar ping northbound 28 miles out. Unknown trajectory, high altitude, no transponder. Brooks snapped her eyes to the screen. Could be a civilian straggler, Martinez offered. Brooks shook her head. Too high, too fast. Not on any flight plan. She flicked a switch. Control, request visual flyby. Closest aircraft. Your bird, Captain. Copy. Sky group, maintain current pattern. I'm going to eyeball. Her jet peeled off from the formation. The others watched her vapor trail cut a sharp arc through the sky. As she closed the distance, Brooks narrowed her eyes at the shape ahead. It wasn't a commercial aircraft. Sleek. Too clean. Then it turned. And suddenly it jammed her radar. Her hold blinked. System scrambled. The T-38 shuddered, not physically but digitally. Like something was hacking it in real time. What the hell? She muttered. Brooks pulled hard to the right, snapping into a downward spiral that would shake any tracking lock. The radar ghost vanished. She pulled level and breathed hard. Control report. Do you still have contact on that bogey? Negative, Captain. It vanished from all scopes. Dorsey's voice cut in. Did you see it? Barely. It wasn't one of ours. Enemy? I don't know, Brooks said. But I'm going to find out. Later that night, back on base, she pulled old surveillance logs from a dusty corner of the comms room. Restricted files. Aircraft signatures. She knew what she'd seen. An angular stealth profile, unregistered. Not US military. But not entirely foreign either. Someone was testing something above Wrightson, and command either didn't know, or didn't want to say. The next day, Vega confronted her.